little bit why as we go on. The transition movement is a name that is given to a lot of what I've described here, where leaders are going to really start to rise up. We're going to see a generation of leaders, according to my research, that are going to come up who are just regular everyday people who will now need to be bold and overcome fear in order to start revamping governmental systems and in order to start creating the type of spiritual realities that are necessary in order to help people transition either from this planet to the next, or if it's not about a transition from planet to planet and it's about kind of a biblical scenery of a kingdom age coming, there are certain requirements that the biblical God has outlined, and there are certain changes that maybe economy here on earth might require of people that will not be acceptable to God. For instance, if you were to change your genetics, would that still be acceptable to God? Because if you're created in the image of God, would it still be acceptable in the eyes of God in the future of things to come for that kind of a change to be made? So these are considerations that I'm insinuating that leaders will try to help ring in and try to help people come into awareness of. And some of this psycho-spiritual awareness is going to be referenced as an architecture. So really, all of this process of building spiritual capacity is building an architecture of leader identity. In terms of leadership psychology, we specialize in areas that have to do with psychology in the workplace and with helping people cope with the changing aspects of new worlds that we're living in. And so my theory ultimately proposes that leadership psychologists, among other sciences and other industries, will be particularly helpful in this kind of a transition. And since psychology is a vast profession, there are a number of different specialties that we can find in that arena. And I felt that this was a point to share because not a lot of people are aware that psychology does have the different facets. It's not just about the clinical aspects, but as you can see here, this is a program of leadership psychologists who are also organizational specialists who will be very instrumental in equipping the leaders that we are going to need for the type of future realities that are going to be coming upon us. So with that, organizations are also founded by entrepreneurs. And so I'm also foreseeing that more and more interest will be put toward the entrepreneurial mindset in leadership programs like our own, because more and more space entrepreneurs are on the rise, and these are going to be the individuals who are going to be the front runners heading out into the new future realities, and we can be here to help them psychologically and just organizationally with the specialty of organizational leadership, not just the psychological aspects of it. Entrepreneurs and creativity is critical, and I highlight entrepreneurs as a particular type of leader that are particularly flexible and adaptable because by very nature of their identity as entrepreneurs, they already need to find a way to globally market themselves in agile ways. And spiritual environments have been noted to have inspired many entrepreneurs. That's the reason why many entrepreneurs practice their entrepreneurship, is because of the spiritual impetus that drives their energies. They actually contribute to the world economy in that way. And here I have lemons because entrepreneurs are really good at that aspect of turning lemons to lemonade, because again, by very nature of being an entrepreneur, they need to know how to turn the market strategy. So a personalized work identity is part of that strategy. And this is what my research is really advocating for, is to help leaders really develop a personalized work identity versus just an organizational identity, which is not integrative, right? It's just the one identity that they have at work or in organizations. But if you have a personalized identity, this is like your personal brand that you have in every arena. And I also include the Imago Dei, meaning the image of God, as a form of personal brand, because creatorship is leadership. And to be created after the creator is part of a brand. All creation requires a creator. And as being the created creatorship, human beings partner with God in making future realities a possibility. So this is something that I highlight in my research, the fact of entrepreneurs and their creativity being a reflection of creatorship and being created after a creator. Now, thinking about the word creative genius, even the word genius has a parenthetical reference to being genetic because, or at least being native. And not only just because of the letters, look similar, but also because it really means having a spirit guardian received at birth. So the picture I'm trying to paint is whether or not we identify as being spiritual or not, everyone is born with a spirit, whether it's the spirit of the times, the spirit of the world. Being a genius is also derivative of the word like genie, as in genie in a bottle. But the connotation is of an invisible deity that needs manifestation in some way. And a spirit in the flesh is basically an attendant spirit within a person that finds manifestation. And sometimes that is what is the creative juice behind some of the work that we see anybody do, any kind of a leader, any individual, any entrepreneur is the point that I'm making. And with that, I want to introduce the idea of phenomenology. Phenomenology is actually one of the original uses of the word psychology, which emphasizes the idea of having an attendant spirit within a person. And so psychology really started out as the study of the mind, the soul, the spirit, as distinguished from the body. So the metaphysical part of our human being. And pneuma really is the actual spirit, the soul, the life force, and quite literally the spirit of God that is living within a particular person. And these are definitions from the Oxford Dictionary. And I just find that it's helpful to learn the etymology of some of these words because, again, returning spirituality to the field of psychology, I think is important. I hear a lot about how a lot of psychologists will denounce spirituality, not knowing that in many regards, psychology began as an industry, as a field that was studying the spirit of God. This is William James, of whom our college is named after. He was an early founder of psychology. He actually is the one who brought psychology to the United States. And he viewed the spiritual orientation to science as the true version of science. He actually launched Harvard's first doctorate program in psychology. Unfortunately, because of all the backlash and the hardship that he would get from his peers talking about spiritual things, he stopped promoting that aspect. But I find it really interesting that the first person to bring psychology to the United States was an avid promoter of the spiritual aspect of it. He even trained to be a minister at one point. Applied spirituality, applied science and applied spirituality is what I'm advocating for here. Really a reunion between science and theology. And, this will help to achieve global efficacy and also help leaders to be able to lead in environments of global and cosmic scale. And decision making will be bolstered by what we call spiritual capital. And with the advent of space travel, psychospiritual identity will help to minimize crises of existential void. So this is the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They already are doing the work of merging science and spirituality. And they help people to understand the difference between knowledge and knowing. Science helps with the knowledge and different knowledge, knowledge acquisition spaces help with the knowledge acquisition. However, we always need spirituality and metaphysical reality in order to help with the revelation aspect of any kind of knowing. So there's a difference between knowledge and knowing. So again, I'm just showing the website here and just showing the different offerings that the Institute of Noetic Sciences presents. They have a project that's called the Global Consciousness Project, and it's parallel to what we would call the Human Genome Project, where the Global Consciousness Project tries to connect the different experiences of consciousness all around the globe, because ultimately we're all connected. And the spirituality helps to emphasize the fact that we are all connected. What one person does on one side of the globe affects people on in other areas of the globe. And this is why we're in the circumstance that we're in, with a globe that is with a planet that is experiencing some deficit in some of our natural resource areas. So here we talk a little bit more about spiritual capital, because maybe some of you are wondering, well, why is spiritual capital so important? Well, first of all, let me define spiritual capital as the power, the influence, and the disposition that is generated by spiritual belief and practice. So just like you would exchange money for goods, you can also, in a sense, exchange spiritual realities for some kind of a good. And the argument that this paper that my research is making is that management and businesses are more competitive when they engage spiritual capital, because spiritual capital is about more than just the individual. It enhances everyone that it comes into contact with by nature of being a spiritual capital. So it's not just about personal gain, it's about everyone having gain. And that's what makes certain individuals or certain businesses have more of a competitive edge, because they engage spiritual capital that energizes people, energizes their workers, their consumers, and it has to do with transcending the private good. Overall, it leads to better decision making because it's for the benefit of all. So typically with entrepreneurship or with some leaders and organizations, we see a profit first mentality. So that's the difference, is that with money, fiscal kinds of capital, biological capital, all these other capitals, there's more exploitation. But with spiritual capital, there are benefits for all, transcending the individual. Saying more about spiritual capital, it's agentic to the learning process, because again, with a spirituality, a container to place all of your metaphysical reality, you are able to have better revelation of everything that's going on in the world around you. So more than working in an environment and learning an environment and acquiring knowledge, with spirituality, you're able to have revelation of the thing that you've learned. It's not enough to just learn a thing. You have to really get the revelation of it. And the spirit is what helps people to achieve that. The spirit also helps people to achieve holism and balance. And this is the structure that spiritual capital brings to workplaces and to leaders. It helps to transcend material success and also helps with the technical aspects of life, because when you're dealing with the holistic nature and you're allowing people to find ways to bring their whole self to work, then they can be more productive and more effectual. And when paired with the right people, having a spiritual organization, spiritual leaders, really helps benefit a people-oriented perspective. Now, as we start to come toward the end of the presentation, I want to mention that spirituality is also seen as a higher order form of development, or a complex development. And it has other benefits, such as generativity. We already talked about transcendence, but really that perspective shift from me to others is what really catalyzes the development aspect of it. When you think of human development in general, babies are not thinking about others because they have a very simple form of development. They can only think about their own self and their needs and getting their needs met. But as they progress into adolescence and into adults, then development becomes more complex, and we're able to have and hold in our mind our own ideologies as well as others' ideologies. And this is what makes spirituality a higher form of development, because it is a reality that comes after the earlier stages of development that has to do with first, knowing the difference between you versus others, and now having even global awareness and really becoming, emerging and becoming, and having a place to be able to put all of that metaphysical reality. And that's what we're calling the emerging and the becoming. These are not things that you can touch and feel. These are processes that happen in order to help you achieve an integrated self. And all of this is part of thinking in systems, which is another leadership psychology phrase. And it, again, is the idea of being able to see that there is growth in complexity. Things move from simple to more complex. And as we can see down in the bottom half, the stages of complexity go from inorganic matter to organic matter to living matter to mind matter. And at the top of that hierarchy is the spiritual matter, because all of the stages before can be seen as building blocks that kind of help with the physical reality, but then the spiritual aspects take people into the metaphysical and the ontological realities. So leaders of the future will do really well to develop more of that kind of an ability, especially because we're going to have a global leadership team or global leadership teams and organizations to manage. So again, the difference between being versus knowing, these are critical in developmental stages. And when it comes to things like crises, these are the things that help people move in their developmental progress, because when people are confronted by crises, then they need to do something about it. They need to do something to resolve the crises, and ultimately that helps with the developmental progression. So leaders, got my pen. Leaders are often depicted as confident, hardworking, and self-aware when they are pursuing a calling. And the evidence is compelling that those who have identified the calling are more unwavering in their career outlook and in their career choices. So these leaders who are engaging a calling as part of a spiritual reality experience more satisfaction in the workplace. And so leaders living a calling also energize followers. They influence the organizational goals, and they improve their own well-being, as well as facilitating a reciprocal care throughout the organization. Because again, spiritual capital is more than just about being about oneself, but is the reality that extends to others. So there's a process called being born again, which I won't get too detailed in, but I mention it here because it brings us back to that idea of pneuma, or to that idea of the genius, basically having a spirit in the flesh. So in the born again process, for many believers, they are undergoing a process where they receive a Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit comes to live within the person and helps to energize the person's spiritual capacity and helps to energize the person's revelation. So day to day, as this person is walking through life and encountering knowledge, the Spirit helps to bring revelation. And so the born again experience is really a project of the Holy Spirit. And so my research does advocate for folks to come to learn about the God of the Bible and to learn about the Holy Spirit and to benefit from the process of being born again, which is a free gift at salvation. And that moves into this idea of having a testimony, which is an idea of having a narrative identity. And studies show that having the ability to tell the narrative of where you come from, talking about your family history, is advantageous. It has numerous benefits because it helps people to know more about their own self and others, and it actually enhances well-being as well as demonstrates advanced identity development. It also corresponds to quality relationships, and it's used to impart lessons. That's the thing about narratives, is that people don't have to live experiences for themselves because they can get the narrative from someone else in their family and know how to proceed based on other people's lived experiences. So the narrative aspect works in the workplace as well. Organizations are able to tell stories that help people to understand the organization at a faster rate through others' experiences versus the individual having to learn experiences for themselves. So those same adolescents who were generative in their family also become generative in the adult stages of their life because they're able to demonstrate advanced development. And this same idea can be attributed to the workplace and to organizations. And it's an opportunity for leaders to ask other leaders, well, how did you get here? What did you do to get here? And what was the experience of getting here? And really to have mentorships in their process. Storied self is also an idea connected to the narrative identity, and it helps with this idea of integrating your accumulated history. So leaders with the ability to not only narrate their lives and have a big picture view of their own life and of the world at large, but who are also able to articulate in the form of a story, show the ability to fuse narratives of self and others, and to talk about maybe the spiritual paths that they've taken to again develop a spiritual architecture of their identity. So rather than seeing different incidents and crises as one-off events, they're seeing things as a big picture view. And again, that's exercising the developmental muscle, the mental muscle that is necessary for advanced adult development, as well as for the future realities that we may see coming. The macro history that we're all living is unfolding before our eyes, because the future of work really is just an unfolding of all of our histories, our combined histories. And so having this narrative identity, understanding who you are in the narrative, the bigger picture narrative, helps you to feel like more of a member of the system globally and in an organization. So leaders who can instill that in themselves and in others will really be effectual, because they're able to boost their own self-worth as well as the worth of others and improve personal agency. So I do present the Bible as a meta narrative because every person who exists today needed to have survived generations of mass scale calamities. Our DNA, this is again emphasizing why our DNA is important and why we need to be protective of changes, potential future changes to our DNA. And the Bible introduces, even in the very first book, Genesis, the beginnings of genetics, the beginnings of creation and creativity, the beginnings of knowledge and knowledge acquisition. And it really is the meta intergenerational narrative. So ultimately, the theory and model I propose encourages people to go back and read the Bible to understand about their narrative identity, to develop a storied self, because by doing this, you develop spiritual capital. And by developing spiritual capital, you are becoming a fuller human being. You are living to a greater capacity because you're able to access all the parts of yourself, not just your physical, but your ontological, metaphysical, spiritual self. So there's more about identity and genetic lineage, and the fact of the Bible being that narrative that is also the defense to biological commoditization. Ultimately, reuniting science and theology is about science being both intellectually and spiritually inclined. So the problematic separation of science from theology is that, oftentimes people believe that the origin of things comes from science, but when you're reading the Bible, you learn that a lot of the things that happen in science were predicted and had already been outlined and had already been proven by different authorized sources of truth. And so, ironically, the more science acquisition people try to attain without spirituality actually keeps people distanced from knowledge and revelation. But the future of our universe is bound to end one way or another. And I think if people can develop spiritual capacity and start to raise up into leaders who have more of a big picture view, that will be beneficial to us all. people will be more authentic and adaptive, and will be able to steward a new reality and have people to have more kind of ownership over what happens to their genetics and their well-being. So this is a reiteration of some of what I've said before, but since I'm going a little longer than I planned, I think we can skip past that and ultimately bring it to the business case, which is that economic value systems have moved from fiscal capital to social capital to intellectual capital to even now moving into biological capital. But this paper and presentation are really emphasizing a spiritual capital and really helping the leader to command their self, because that